And we continue with the Great Northern War.
In the aftermath of defeating Polish-Saxon forces and signing the Treaty of Ulltranstadt in October, Charles did not leave Saxony immediately, instead choosing to settle down for winter. This was primarily done so the Swedish army could rest following 6 years of nearly constant campaigning. It also served the purpose of pressuring the Saxons into gathering the war indemnities as quickly as possible. The treaty itself was not immediately signed by Augustus, as he was still in Poland with Peter. The Tsar terrified Augustus, so much so that the Elector of Saxony did not dare tell him of his unconditional surrender. Augustus was indeed stuck between a rock and a hard place. He was forced to accompany Menshikov and the new Russian army, which Peter had sent to Poland. At the same time, he knew that facing a Swedish army in battle after surrendering would not be taken lightly by Charles. In fact, during the very signing of the treaty, Augustus was on the march from Lithuania to Lublin because Menshikov intended to fight a Swedish army in western Poland. That Swedish army, led by Mardefelt, received a letter of warning from Augustus about his situation and what Menshikov's goals were. Mardefelt, still uninformed about the signing of the Treaty of Ulltranstadt, thought that it was another ruse by Augustus and did the contrary of what the Elector had asked him to do. Mardefelt was initially hesitant to—
Man, Augustus is in this weird situation right now, right? Where he's trying to help now because he can't mess with Charles anymore, so this is such a weird situation.
Face Menshikov in battle due to the Allied army's size. Alas, he was encouraged by the voivode of Kiev, Józef Potocki, who said that the Polish soldiers would fight to the last drop of blood, and decided to march towards the Allies' position at Kalisz. The Swedish-Polish army found an advantageous position between the villages of Dobrzec and Kozelnawicz and arrayed in battle formation. Menshikov's army formed up across from them. Mardefelt had around 4,000 men under his command, with another 9,000 to 10,000 Polish allies under Potocki. On the other hand, Menshikov had over twice as many men: 5,000 Saxons, 9,000 Russians, 4,000 to 8,000 Cossacks and Kalmyks, and another 7,000 troops belonging to the Sandomierz Confederation. The Swedish soldiers were placed in the center, while the Polish cavalry was on the flanks. Meanwhile, Menshikov placed his own Polish troops in the center and the Russian and Saxon forces on the flanks. However, he also left a cavalry contingent on the far left side for flanking purposes. Both sides had between 10 and 15 guns, although it is unknown whether they were of any significance to the battle. The battle commenced on the 29th of October between 3 and 4 p.m. Wanting to prove Mardefelt wrong for implying that the Polish were cowards who avoided battle, Potocki led his cavalry on a massive charge towards Menshikov's line. At the first charge, after only several minutes of fighting, Potocki's troops started fleeing, with some of them even retreating behind a wagon fort. The Swedish troops, now left alone against a massive army, prepared for the inevitable. Menshikov's entire army fell upon the 4,000 Swedes. Nevertheless, neither Mardefelt nor his troops would break as easily as their Polish allies did. During the fighting, both sides lost a lot of their cavalry units. The Swedish forces were slowly defeated, and in a last-ditch effort, Mardefelt formed a hollow square with whatever troops he could rally and held on until late into the night. Those troops stopped fighting and surrendered only after their enemies stopped attacking first. In fact, some sources claim that Mardefelt's men held out longer than the Polish forces behind the wagon fort. In the end, the Swedish—
I love how the Polish were so desperate to prove they weren't cowards and then fled the moment they got pushed back. Yeah, that sucks.
The Polish army lost almost 5,000 men, over 2,000 of which were imprisoned, while the Allied army suffered around 3,000 casualties. As a result of this battle, Greater Poland, the only part of the Commonwealth left under Charles and his allies' control, was left undefended. Menshikov was unable to capitalize on this, however, as Augustus retreated to Warsaw and left his troops in Kraków. To smooth things over with Charles, Augustus took as many Swedish prisoners as he could and released them when he was able to do so. Still petrified at the thought of
Dude, Augustus, what are you doing? Like, he signed this treaty, and then he's like a double agent now? Like, what's going on with this guy? I mean, the fact that he was even there when Menshevik defeated, you know, some of Charles's team guys, isn't it already a violation? But because he's too afraid to tell the Tsar that he's given up, he's just going along now. I guess he's just being a double agent? Like, oh my goodness. I'm just like, Augustus, what are you doing, dude? What's going on here?
Peter's reaction to his unconditional surrender, Augustus waited until the dead of winter to leave for Saxony. Peter was enraged after learning of the Saxon capitulation because he knew that his position in Poland was hanging by a thread. The Russian army retreated across the Vistula and destroyed all of the bridges on the river, hoping to slow down the inevitable Swedish advance. Left without any proper allies, Peter tried to keep the Polish resistance against the Swedes alive by all means. At first, he tried to bribe and threaten the Polish nobility into not acknowledging Stanisław as king. With Poland devastated by the civil war, the vast majority of the magnates refused to fight the Swedes even if they did not support Stanisław. Having failed to rally the magnates to his side diplomatically, the Russians started brutally raiding the Polish and Lithuanian countryside, and they also besieged the important port of Gdansk. The siege was easily repelled, and military pressure proved to be impractical, as now Peter was just making more enemies. As a final desperate measure to keep the war in the Commonwealth alive, the Tsar sent an envoy to Pope Clement XI. He promised to work on reuniting the Catholic and Orthodox churches if the Holy See denounced Stanisław as king. Whether his intentions were sincere or not is unknown, though the talks broke down quickly regardless.
Yeah, Peter's kind of in a desperate act to try to salvage the situation now that Augustus is out of the picture, huh?
Without allies, and with the Russian army exhausted by war, Peter went to great lengths to make peace with Charles. He even offered to return all of the conquered lands except for St. Petersburg and the forts along the Neva. The ambitious Charles XII was confident in victory, however, and said to his commanders, "Gentlemen, I have resolved never to make an unjust war, but to end a just one only with the utter ruin of my enemies. I will attack the first to take the field, conquer him, and then deal with the others."
Okay, so this is kind of worked out with the Augustus and Saxony situation. Charles refused all 1,000 peace offers and got rid of Augustus, so it kind of worked, but a part of me is like, also a bit like, maybe this is a good time to make peace with Russia and just focus on Poland / Saxony, you know, and then maybe deal with it later. I don't know. Like, I don't know. I mean, we also know that Charles eventually does invade Russia and just gets demolished, so maybe he should have just taken the Russian offer here, maybe. You know what I mean? But, yeah, I get it, but like, I don't know.
Hampered by the constant arrival of foreign diplomats, the slow arrival of reinforcements, and by Augustus himself, the Swedish forces only left Saxony in the autumn of 1707. At the end of the year, Charles crossed the Vistula with his army. Peter, who was celebrating Christmas in Moscow, left for Grodno immediately after hearing of the Swedish advance. He did not stay there for long, as the city was an easy target for the unified Swedish army. Incidentally, Charles entered the city 3 days after Peter left it. During his retreat to Vilnius, Peter ordered his Cossacks and Kalmyks to ravage the countryside and burn everything that the Swedish army could use. This strategy left the Swedish army with a chronic lack of supplies, facing...
Scorched Earth. Scorched Earth policy. Very effective every time I seen it used. So, yeah, Peter ain't an idiot, dude. Like, maybe should have made peace, Charles. At least with this one.
Starvation, they took the last supplies that the peasants had, even further devastating the area. Meanwhile, Peter grew ill in early 1708, leaving all military affairs to his generals. Ill health struck him when he was facing the worst internal disorder of his reign, the Don Cossack revolt led by Bulavin. News of Peter's failing health, as well as the revolt, made the Russian army fall into disorder. Men were deserting at an alarming rate, and morale was low. The generals were also bogged down in Mahilov, as they could not agree on whether the war should be continued with Sweden. Furthermore, 32,000 men also had to be detached from the main army in order to quell Bulavin's revolt. It was anyone's guess which way Charles would go from Grodno, into Livonia or towards St. Petersburg, towards Moscow or into Ukraine. At first, he left Grodno in a northeasterly direction. Petrified at the thought of losing his new capital, Peter ordered St. Petersburg to be additionally fortified. After forcing the city of Vilnius to resupply the army, Charles turned towards the southeast and encamped at Minsk. While there, General Leeuwenhaupt informed Charles that his army in Livonia was ready to march south and support the main army. In the following weeks, some Swedish and Russian forces exchanged fire on the outskirts of the city. This incident made Charles aware of the poor state of the Russian army. Seeing this as a perfect opportunity, Charles decided to attack the Russians at Mahilov and then directly advance towards Moscow. The Tsar ordered his generals to hold the defensive line around Mahilov at all costs, as Moscow could be easily assaulted from there. Capitalizing on the disorder within the Russian armies due to recent events, Charles sent a small diversionary force under Sparre to Borisov in order to stall Goltz and his 8,000 men. The main Swedish force arrived at Bereza-Sapieska on the 25th of June and immediately started working on crossing the rivers and marshes in front of them. By the time Goltz realized what was happening, Charles was already halfway to Mahilov. Utterly surprised by the speed at which the Swedish army crossed such difficult terrain, Sheremetev and Menshikov left to form a defensive line at Holovchin, 24 kilometers away from Mahilov. Charles arrived near the town of Holovchin on the 10th of July. There he met a strong Russian cavalry force, which he did not yet have enough men to engage in a direct battle. The cavalry retreated slowly across the river. Because of the thick forests that surrounded the town, the majority of the Swedish army arrived only later that day. There was very little action in the next couple of days, as the Swedes waited for all of their units to arrive, while the Russian army was fortifying its position. Those fortifications were completed on the 13th. Trenches ran down the river and edge of the forest for several kilometers, and many artillery batteries were placed along those lines, along with a chevaux de frise. The Russian army was led by fierce rivals Menshikov and Sheremetev, as well as Repnin. They had around 30,000 men on their side. The Swedish army, led by Charles, consisted of 12 to 13,000 men, together with 28 artillery pieces. The Russian army was spread over the entire length of the trenches. However, the parts of the army that were under the command of different generals had barely any communication with each other. At 1:30 at night, the Swedish artillery, which was placed on a hill, started firing on the Russian positions under Repnin. Afterwards, the Swedish army started crossing the Vabik River, with Charles being again the first to enter the water. The Russian soldiers...
So it seems like the divide and conquer, the Russians, there's some rivalries, they're spread thin, and so it seems like this is the perfect opportunity for Charles to kind of recreate his earlier success, divide and conquer certain parts, move on to the other. I'm wondering if it's going to work out this time, or is something bad's going to happen. Though right now it seems promising. if it works out.
Could not fight the Swedish crossing due to relentless artillery fire. As each unit crossed, they started engaging the Russians in battle, forcing a large part of Repnin's forces to retreat to the forest behind them. A part of the Swedish infantry wheeled to the left after crossing, thereby cutting off Repnin from the rest of the Russian army. The Russian infantry passed over their own trenches to reach the marshland. This led to them getting separated from the cavalry along the trenches, which were afterwards quickly routed. Once the Swedish forces reached the forest where the Russian infantry retreated, they came under heavy fire. At that point, Charles rode to every infantry battalion and urged them to fight the Russians with pikes and swords, rather than fire at them. They subsequently charged the Russian forces in the forest and quickly defeated them in hand-to-hand combat. By that time, it was already too late for the rest of the Russian army to offer any assistance, so they retreated to Shklov. The Swedish forces lost only around 250 men, while the Russians suffered some 2,000 casualties. As the Russian commanders didn't expect Charles to attack such a difficult position, effectively only a third of the Russian army actually participated in the battle. Charles decisively defeated the disorganized Russian army at the Battle of Holovchin. However, the majority of the soldiers and generals escaped unharmed to Smolensk. The bridges across the Dnieper were burned during the retreat. The Swedish soldiers were exhausted from the forced marching, food shortages, and bad weather, so they could not build new bridges for a month. After crossing the Dnieper, it became evident that the Russian forces had extensively employed scorched earth tactics. The area between Mahilov and Smolensk was completely devastated, with peasants fleeing with their cattle into the forests and leaving neither crops, tools, nor any other kind of supplies for the Swedes. Additionally, the Russian army burned down almost all buildings, leaving no sturdy shelter from the worsening weather. Seeing a direct advance towards Moscow as suicide, the Swedish command reviewed their possible options. As Charles refused to advance into Russia in the aftermath of the Battle of Narva, it came as a surprise to many that he chose to do so now. A variety of factors contributed to his decision. His belief that Ruthenia was a prosperous and resource-rich land, that the Ukrainians wanted to rebel against the Russians, and that he could expect aid from the Cossacks and Crimean Tatars. Meanwhile, a Polish army advanced into Ruthenia as well. The hetman of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, Ivan Mazepa, was worried at this confluence of several large armies into his lands. He asked Peter for military support. However, the Tsar refused, content to just shadow the Swedish army during its march. Mazepa saw this as a betrayal of a treaty between.
Okay, so Charles wants to go to Moscow. He thinks with all the eternal strife, he's gonna get the advantage, and he feels confident. So I think he's walking to his doom. Like I said, I know that at the end, the Russians win, and that this invasion goes horribly of Russia. It's one of the infamous failed invasions of Russia, so Charles, you're a go-getter, but I think you're walking straight into your doom.
The Cossacks and Russia, and promptly allied with the Poles and the Swedes. The Russians retaliated quickly, seizing the Zaporozhian capital of Baturin, massacring all of its inhabitants and allegedly tying them to crosses and floating them down the Dnieper. The Russian army also continuously employed scorched earth tactics, depleting the land of anything useful. Trying to avoid further Russian reprisals, the Zaporozhians replaced Mazepa with a new hetman and continued fighting on the Russian side. The Swedish army, once again low on supplies, was eager for the arrival of the support army. Lewenhaupt's support army was supposed to meet the main army at Mahilov in August. With significantly fewer men and resources than planned, they nonetheless managed to leave Riga in July. Due to bad weather, they fell significantly behind the main army. Peter was aware that Charles was expecting a relief force, which put Lewenhaupt's army at great risk as soon as they were discovered. His army crossed the Dnieper River on the 2nd or 3rd of October. Russian troops started harassing them as soon as the 6th. On the 9th, the support army was merely 10 kilometers away from Slavhorat, Propoysk, where they planned to cross the Sos. It was at that point, near the village of Lesnaya, that a large Russian army started attacking them. Because of previous raids and rumors that Russian troops had already taken Propoysk, Lewenhaupt arrayed his support army defensively. 700 infantry and cavalry were placed at the front, followed by half the baggage. They were followed by several cavalry units, behind which was the rest of the baggage train. The remaining soldiers were placed at the edge of the forest in order to prevent any attacks. In total, Lewenhaupt had between 12,000 and 13,000 soldiers at his disposal, along with 16 artillery pieces. Not all of them would participate in the battle though, as about a quarter were posted to defend the baggage train. The Russian army was led by Peter himself, though he had some of his most competent generals there also. Besides the 1,000 men which took Propoysk, the Russian army numbered between 26,000 and 28,000 men, together with a massive number of cannons, possibly around 100. The battle started when the 700 Swedish soldiers in the front came under fire from the 1,000 Russian soldiers that took Propoysk. The main Russian army, on the other hand, advanced in 2 columns towards the Swedish positions, with the main goal being to take the clearing in the forest and the bridge over the Lesnyanka stream. Menshikov's 7,000-strong column reached the forest clearing. However, they were quickly pushed back by 900 Swedes using their famous Karolian shock tactics. Hearing the gunfire, another Swedish regiment marched towards the gunfire, causing confusion within the 2 groups. Those regiments suffered some losses and were forced to retreat. Peter's and Menshikov's columns joined up at a crossroads near the Lesnyanka river, where they were met by 2,000 Swedes under Stekelberg. After his position was reinforced by another 2,500 men, Stekelberg's troops started pushing Peter's column back, even capturing some of their guns. It was only the elite Russian guards that held the line and prevented a complete rout. The Russians were much more successful in their other column. Menshikov's flanking maneuver managed to completely push the Swedes out of the forest clearing. Stekelberg subsequently ordered a retreat towards Lesnaya, leaving the Russians in control of the forest. Lewenhaupt attempted a counterattack to regain control, though he was unsuccessful. The fighting subsequently transferred to the fields outside Lesnaya. After a pause in the fighting, at 4 p.m. the armies started battling again. A newly arrived Russian cavalry force under Bauer charged the Swedish lines. As Karolian tactics excel in open terrain, Bauer was pushed back. In the next couple of hours, the Swedes killed many Russian soldiers. However, the sheer size of the Russian army ensured that they would suffer quite a few casualties too. Over time, they were pushed closer and closer to Lesnaya, leaving the bridge over the Lesnyanka exposed to Russian attacks. Just as the Swedish army was on the brink of defeat, the 700 soldiers that were at the front of the baggage train arrived and repulsed the Russian forces at the bridge. With their arrival, the united Swedish army fought even more aggressively and managed to push the Russian army back.
This has been a tug of war. I must say, I was expecting Peter to just completely, stomp them, but the Swedish are putting up an impressive resistance. I was expecting this to be a one-sided battle, but so far it's been a tug of war, and they even managed to drive them back. The Swedish really make numbers nearly, not... I know numbers aren't everything in war, obviously, but, the Swedish really show that, huh? They are constantly outnumbered and still pulling off great victories. It's kind of insane.
At 7 p.m, the battle stopped. The Russians retreated to the forest to recuperate, while the Swedes stood in battle formation for several hours still, expecting a night attack. The attack never came though. Not wanting to waste time, Lewenhaupt ordered the army to assemble and to start marching towards the Soz at once. With the carriages and artillery being a much greater burden with so many fewer men, the general ordered the guns to be sunk in the marshes. By the time they reached Propoysk, the Russians had already put the town to the torch. Expecting an enemy attack at any moment, Leeuwenhoek later ordered that all of the baggage which cannot be carried across the river should be burned or left behind. The soldiers used this opportune moment to indulge in food and drink. Many of them would wander drunk into the forest and marshes, never to be seen again. In the end, the Russians lost about 7,000 men in the Battle of Lesnaya, while the Swedes lost around 3,000. On the other hand, Leeuwenhoek lost many more men at Propoysk to fear and alcohol. Only half of the men and very few provisions ended up crossing the Soz in the end. The small force which did reach Charles was nowhere near as strong as he had hoped. Moreover, the winter of 1708 to 1709 was one of the coldest on record. This, together with the scorched earth tactics, left the Swedish army in a disastrous state. Thousands of soldiers starved to death or succumbed to disease, and many simply froze to death. The Russians suffered many casualties during winter as well, though nowhere near as many as the Swedes. At the approach of spring, Charles was left with less than half of the men that he had started the campaign with. The great Cossack rebellion which he expected did not materialize. Mazeppa promised tens of thousands of soldiers for the upcoming battles against the Russians, yet the number that he could realistically muster was much smaller than that. Charles's last hope was Stanisław. The Polish and Swedish forces kept regular lines of communication during their advance into Ruthenia. Since correspondence between the two forces stopped during winter, Charles assumed that the weather simply bogged down his allies' army. The reality of the situation turned out to be far more disheartening. Stanisław's armies retreated into Poland to consolidate power, and due to a miscommunication between himself and his commanders, nobody informed Charles that he was left alone. In the end, it was one of his own envoys to the Ottoman Empire that informed the Swedish king of Stanisław's position. Unable to advance or retreat, Charles saw only one option for his army's survival. He needed to capture a well-provisioned fort and wait until support arrived.
Yeah, maybe you should have made peace with the Russians when Peter was offering it, Charles. You were a bit too relentless, I think. But, yeah, I think... And it's just that scorched earth, man. Like, the Russians keep using that, and it keeps denying Charles any chance of provisions, so... Again, the scorched earth, man, reigns supreme. It's just beyond effective.
1st of May 1709, the Swedish army besieged the port of Poltava, some 300 kilometers east of Kiev. The Swedes could have taken the fort easily by force. However, Charles did not want to risk any unnecessary damage to the defenses or the grain stores. Peter saw this moment as critical. He advanced towards Poltava from northern Ruthenia and ordered most of his senior generals to assemble there with their troops. By June 15th, the entire Russian army had arrived on the east bank of the Voskla River. Peter's primary objective was to cross the river with his army. To divert the attention of the Swedes, he sent some cavalry to feign a crossing south of Poltava. Charles then rode out of his camp to see what was happening. What occurred next was one of those minor chance events that sometimes decides the fate of nations. The Swedish king was shot in the foot by a Cossack and refused to have the wound tended to until he nearly fell unconscious. To make matters worse, this took place on June 17th, his birthday, a bad omen which further demoralized the Swedish troops. While Charles was weakened by...
Oh, that's not good. And the whole Russian army is advancing. Dang, Charles. Dang, everything is suddenly now turning.
Fever, his generals could not agree on the response against the Russians. Peter used this opportunity to cross the river and set up camp north of Poltava. The camp was fortified afterwards, and a series of redoubts were built. To the rear, the Russian position was protected by the river and marshland. There was no chance of the Swedes mounting any flanking maneuvers. The Swedish army numbered around 22,000 men, with a similar amount of cavalry and infantry. They also had around 30 guns. However, the artillery was not used during the battle, since Charles anticipated a quick breakthrough. There were also around 3,000 of Mazeppa's Cossacks and 1,000 Poles on the Swedish side. The Russian army had in total around 80,000 men, with over 30,000 infantry, around 20,000 horsemen, and 23 to 25,000 Cossacks and Kalmyks. The Russians also had over 100 guns. The numbers and the positions of the armies remind us of the Battle of Narva. Nevertheless, there are two important differences here. The Swedish army wasn't led by its best commander, and the Russian army had been transformed from a peasant mob into a credible fighting machine. The Swedish War Council debated on whether they should use a cautious or aggressive plan of attack. The more senior commanders in the army preferred a steady offensive, while the younger ones proposed an all-out attack. In the end, the king chose to heed the advice to strike the iron while it's hot. Unable to take part in the battle himself, Charles devised a battle plan and entrusted it to Field Marshal Rienshold. What Charles did not know was that the Field Marshal was on bad terms with most of the other generals. On account of that, he failed to relay the plans properly to them, dealing a significant blow to the organization and cohesion of the army before the battle even started. Preparations for the battle started on the 9th of July 7th.
Yo, that sucks. Yeah, I'm guessing the Russians just win now, right? Like, I'm just guessing they're about to dominate. Oh dear. I didn't know Charles just wasn't involved that much in this fight, and now the disunity of his subordinates, like Reinshod. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce his name. Like, he proved he can handle the odds when he fought, but again, if he's not informing everyone else, then that's not gonna work. Oh dear. I feel like this is where Russia finally comes out on top.
The Swedes left 2,500 men to guard the baggage train and camp, 2,000 in front of Poltava to prevent a breakout, and another 1,500 to check the Cossacks and Kalmyks. A crucial part of Charles's plan was the element of surprise, so the army started preparing to attack at night. The lack of organization became evident here, as the cavalry took too long to form up and the summer night was quite short. By the time the Swedes were ready to attack, the Russians were already alert. At 4 AM, General Rus started the Swedish offensive by trying to envelop the first frontal redoubts. The Swedes attacked relentlessly and took the first two, but they were unable to advance further. Russian artillery devastated the assaulting soldiers, and they did not have enough men left to attack the remaining redoubts. The Russian commanders still feared the Swedish troops, and asked Peter to send the infantry from his camp to aid the defenders at the redoubts. Peter decided to not make any unnecessary moves, since he knew that the Swedes were suffering heavy casualties, and that it would only be a matter of time before they lost steam. While this was happening, Löwenhaupt and Rienshold drove back the main body of the Russian army behind the redoubts. However, they did not coordinate their attacks well enough and were split up. Charles, watching the battle from afar, ordered both Rus and Löwenhaupt to reconnect with the main body of the army outside of the Russian camp. Rus had lost most of his men already and decided to retreat to a redoubt by the river, where he later surrendered. Löwenhaupt, after several hours of inconclusive fighting, led his 2,400 men through intense artillery fire to Rienshold's force. With what was left of the Swedish army united, they began advancing towards the main Russian force. It was at this point that Peter ordered the gates of the camp to be opened, and 30,000 of his infantry to array in battle lines.
Oh my goodness. And now the fresh, troops of Peter are, not only are they numerically superior, but they're also fresh. Oh my goodness, yeah, this is just a complete... I feel like this is just gonna be a complete slaughter.
The cavalry subsequently formed up at the flanks. The Swedish commanders, seeing that the Russian line was significantly wider than their own, stretched the Karolians thin in an effort to avoid envelopment. While they were approaching the Russian army, Peter's artillery devastated the Swedish forces.
It's the lack of artillery from the Swedish that scares me. Not only are they outnumbered, but I don't know, I feel like in the Napoleonic era, we covered, any army without artillery, it's instantly defeated or dead. I know this is much earlier than the Napoleonic era, but it's like, it goes to show you just the power of artillery, the importance of it. And the fact that the Swedish don't have any, like, frightens me. It's like, yo. And he said earlier, because Charles didn't feel like it was necessary, I'm like, ish. Oy vey, you know? Oh no.
Fearless in the face of death, the elite Swedish infantry approached until they could see the white in their enemies' eyes and unleash several musket volleys. What was supposed to be their deadliest weapon came to be almost useless. The winter cold and bad weather in the last year reduced the quality of their gunpowder, and most of the shots did not even reach the Russians. The Russian volleys, in contrast, killed many Swedes. Starving, exhausted, and hopelessly outnumbered, the entire Swedish army charged. The few units which made it to the Russian lines fought bravely before being killed. Sources tell that only the company led by Count Torstensson, grandson of the famous Lennart Torstensson, managed to penetrate the Russian lines before being enveloped and massacred together with their leader. As the defeated Swedes retreated from the battlefield, the Russian cavalry pursued them and cut down many. Meanwhile, Charles, after having his bodyguards killed by a cannonball, gathered what was left of his army and retreated south. In the end, the Swedes lost around 7,000 men, with a further 2,700 captured, including Rienschold and other top commanders. The Russians had 1,300 men killed and another 3,300 injured. Constantly pursued by the Russian army under Menshikov, Charles sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire with 1,000 of his men. The rest of his army, in the hands of Löwenhaupt, surrendered to the Russians at Perevalochna 3 days after the battle. The captured commanders were kept as Peter's prisoners, while the soldiers that caused Peter so much trouble were settled in Siberia. For Sweden, the Battle of Poltava was a catastrophic defeat. Its elite continental army was annihilated, grievously reducing its defensive capabilities. Peter called his great victory at Poltava a divine miracle, as he finally managed to defeat the most formidable army in Europe. Russian armies would now be free to encroach into Poland and the Baltic without any resistance. Following nearly a decade of Swedish domination in the Great Northern War, Russia would now gain the upper hand.
Dang, yo, Charles. And that's why we don't invade Russia, folks. Holy crap. Dang, completely broken in one foul swoop. Oh, man. I'm binge watching this, so we need to jump forward. I'm gonna jump to the next part. I'll see you guys tomorrow. We gotta get to this.